Who was Joseph Stalin and what role did he play in the Soviet Union? Joseph Stalin was a Soviet politician and dictator who ruled the Soviet Union from the mid-1920s until his death in 1953. He was born in 1878 in Georgia and rose to power through his work in the Communist Party of the Soviet Union. Stalin played a key role in transforming the Soviet Union into an industrial and military superpower, but his leadership was marked by brutal purges, repression, and forced collectivization. He oversaw the execution of millions of people, many of whom were political opponents, and his policies led to widespread famine and suffering. Under Stalin's leadership, the Soviet Union played a crucial role in defeating Nazi Germany in World War II, but he also instigated a tense and dangerous Cold War with the United States and its allies. Despite his many achievements, Stalin's legacy is one of authoritarianism, brutality, and human rights abuses. What were Stalin's political beliefs and how did they influence his actions? Stalin's political beliefs were deeply rooted in Marxist-Leninist ideology, which emphasized the importance of a strong, centralized government led by the Communist Party. He believed that the Soviet Union could only achieve socialism and eventually communism by rapidly industrializing and modernizing its economy, and by eliminating opposition to the Communist Party and its policies. Stalin's political beliefs were reflected in his actions as the leader of the Soviet Union. He initiated a series of policies aimed at transforming the Soviet Union into a modern, industrialized state. These policies included the collectivization of agriculture, the rapid industrialization of the economy, and the development of a centralized system of government planning. Stalin was also committed to the idea of creating a socialist society, in which the means of production were owned and controlled by the state. He believed that socialism could only be achieved through the elimination of capitalist elements within society, including private property and individual freedoms. Stalin's political beliefs also led him to view opposition to the Communist Party and its policies as a threat to the Soviet Union's stability and security. He therefore took a hardline approach to dissent, using violence and repression to suppress political opposition, including purges of party members and intellectuals. Overall, Stalin's political beliefs were characterized by a strong commitment to Marxist-Leninist ideology and a determination to transform the Soviet Union into a modern, industrialized socialist state. However, his methods for achieving these goals were often ruthless and led to widespread human suffering and political repression. Some text goes here. How did Stalin rise to power in the Soviet Union, and what methods did he use to maintain his authority? Some text goes here. Stalin rose to power in the Soviet Union through a combination of his own political skill and a series of circumstances that allowed him to consolidate power within the Communist Party. In the aftermath of the Russian Revolution of 1917, Stalin quickly rose through the ranks of the Communist Party. By the late 1920s, he had become one of the party's most influential figures, thanks in part to his role as General Secretary of the party's Central Committee, which gave him significant control over party appointments and personnel. Stalin's rise to power was also facilitated by the death of Vladimir Lenin in 1924, which left a power vacuum at the top of the party. Stalin was able to outmaneuver his rivals, such as Leon Trotsky, to emerge as the party's dominant leader. Once in power, Stalin used a number of methods to maintain his authority over the Communist Party and the Soviet Union. These included 1. Purges. Stalin purged the party of real and imagined opponents, including Trotsky and other leaders who posed a threat to his authority. The purges extended to the wider population, with many people being imprisoned, exiled or executed. 2. Propaganda. Stalin used propaganda to promote his image as a strong leader and to create a cult of personality around himself. This included mass rallies, posters, and films that portrayed Stalin as the embodiment of the Soviet Union and its ideals. 3. Secret police. Stalin's regime employed the secret police, NKVD, to monitor and suppress dissent. The NKVD was responsible for many of the arrests, executions, and forced labor camps that characterized Stalin's reign. 4. 5-year plans. Stalin implemented a series of 5-year plans to rapidly industrialize the Soviet economy. This allowed him to consolidate power and control resources, as well as mobilize the population around the goal of building a modern socialist state. 5. Centralization of power. Stalin centralized power in the Soviet Union, taking control of the government, the party, and the military. This gave him complete control over the country and made it difficult for opponents to challenge his rule. Overall, Stalin's rise to power and maintenance of authority were characterized by ruthless tactics, including purges, propaganda, secret police, and centralization of power. These methods allowed Stalin to become one of the most powerful and feared leaders of the 20th century. Some text goes here. What were the key events of Stalin's reign, and how did they shape the course of Soviet history? Some text goes here. Stalin's reign was marked by a number of key events that had a significant impact on the course of Soviet history. Some of the most notable events include: 1. The Great Purge, 1936 to 1938. This was a period of political repression during which Stalin carried out mass arrests, show trials, and executions of suspected opponents of the Soviet government. The purges resulted in the deaths of hundreds of thousands of people and had a lasting impact on Soviet society. 2. World War II, 1939 to 1945. Stalin's leadership during World War II was instrumental in the Soviet Union's victory over Nazi Germany. However, the war also resulted in significant human and economic losses for the Soviet Union. 3. Industrialization and collectivization, 1928 to 1940. Stalin's policies of rapid industrialization and collectivization transformed the Soviet Union from an agricultural society into a modern, industrialized state. However, these policies also led to widespread famine, suffering, and loss of life. 4. The Cold War, 1947 to 1991. Stalin's post-World War II policies and the tensions between the Soviet Union and the Western powers led to the start of the Cold War, a period of political and military tension that lasted for several decades. 5. The Cult of Personality. Stalin's cult of personality was a system of propaganda and adulation that elevated Stalin to a position of almost divine status in Soviet society. The cult of personality had a lasting impact on Soviet culture and society, and was a key element of Stalin's power and authority. Overall, the key events of Stalin's reign had a profound impact on the course of Soviet history, shaping the country's politics, economy, and society for decades to come. Despite the brutality and repression that characterized Stalin's rule, he is still remembered by some as a strong leader who helped to build the Soviet Union into a world power. Some text goes here. What were the main policies and initiatives of Stalin's government, and what impact did they have on the Soviet Union and its people? Some text goes here. 1. 5-year plans. Stalin implemented a series of 5-year plans that aimed to rapidly industrialize the Soviet economy. The plans involved massive investments in heavy industry, transportation, and infrastructure. The first 5-year plan began in 1928 and resulted in significant economic growth and modernization, but also led to widespread famine and suffering. 2. Collectivization. Stalin's government implemented a policy of collectivization, which involved consolidating small farms into larger, collective farms. The goal was to increase agricultural productivity and modernize the farming sector. However, collectivization led to widespread resistance and resulted in famine and suffering for many people, particularly in Ukraine. 3. Secret police and repression. Stalin's regime employed a powerful secret police force, the NKVD, to monitor and suppress dissent. The NKVD was responsible for carrying out the Great Purge, a period of political repression during which hundreds of thousands of people were imprisoned, executed, or sent to labor camps. 4. Propaganda and the cult of personality. Stalin's government used propaganda and the cult of personality to promote the idea of Stalin as a strong and infallible leader. This involved portraying Stalin as the embodiment of the Soviet Union and its ideals, and suppressing dissenting views. 5. Education and science. Stalin's government invested heavily in education and science, with the goal of creating a highly educated and skilled population. This included building new universities, increasing access to education, and promoting Soviet achievements in science and technology. Overall, the policies and initiatives of Stalin's government had a complex impact on the Soviet Union and its people. While they led to significant economic growth and modernization, they also resulted in widespread suffering, repression, and loss of life. The legacy of Stalin's policies is still felt in the region today, with many people remembering his rule as a period of terror and oppression. Some text goes here. How did Stalin's policies affect the lives of ordinary citizens in the Soviet Union? Some text goes here. 1. Famine and hunger. The policies of collectivization and rapid industrialization resulted in widespread famine and hunger, particularly in rural areas. The government seized grain from farmers, which led to food shortages and starvation. Millions of people died as a result of famine and malnutrition. 2. Political repression. Stalin's regime used the secret police to monitor and suppress dissent. People who were perceived as a threat to the government were imprisoned, executed, or sent to labor camps. Many innocent people were falsely accused and punished. This climate of fear and repression had a chilling effect on free speech and political activism. 3. Forced labor. The government used forced labor to build infrastructure and carry out other projects. People who were sent to labor camps often worked long hours in dangerous and difficult conditions. Many died from exhaustion, disease, or mistreatment. 4. Propaganda and control of information. Stalin's government tightly controlled the media and used propaganda to shape public opinion. People were taught to idolize Stalin and to believe in the superiority of Soviet communism. Dissenting views were suppressed and punished. 5. Limited economic opportunity. While the Soviet Union experienced significant economic growth during Stalin's reign, many people had limited economic opportunities. The government controlled most industries and jobs, and upward mobility was difficult. The quality of life for many people remained low, particularly in rural areas. Some text goes here. What were the major criticisms of Stalin's rule, and how have historians evaluated his legacy? Some text goes here. 1. Political repression. Stalin's regime was responsible for the imprisonment, torture, and execution of millions of people. Critics argue that the government's tactics were unjust and violated human rights. 2. Economic mismanagement. While the Soviet Union experienced significant economic growth during Stalin's reign, many argue that the government's policies were inefficient and caused unnecessary. What were the consequences of Stalin's leadership for the Soviet Union and for global politics? The consequences of Stalin's leadership for the Soviet Union and global politics were significant and far-reaching. Some of the key consequences include: 1. Domestic consequences: Stalin's leadership had a profound impact on the Soviet Union. His policies of collectivization, industrialization, and political repression transformed the country, but also resulted in significant human suffering. Millions of people died as a result of famine, labor camps, and political purges. The legacy of Stalin's rule is still felt in the region today, with many people remembering his reign as a period of repression and fear. 2. Cold War. Stalin's leadership was a major factor in the emergence of the Cold War. The Soviet Union's aggressive foreign policy, including its expansion into Eastern Europe and its pursuit of nuclear weapons, created tensions with the West. The United States and its allies viewed the Soviet Union as a threat to global security, and the resulting arms race and proxy conflicts defined international politics for decades. 3. Spread of communism. Stalin's leadership helped to spread communist ideology throughout the world. The Soviet Union provided support to communist movements in many countries, including China, Cuba, and Vietnam. While some of these movements were successful in achieving political power, others led to conflict and instability. 4. International organizations. Stalin's leadership led to the formation of several international organizations, including the United Nations and the International Monetary Fund. These organizations were created in response to the challenges of global politics in the aftermath of World War II, and were designed to promote peace, stability, and economic development. Overall, the consequences of Stalin's leadership were complex and multifaceted. While he transformed the Soviet Union into a global superpower, his policies also resulted in significant human suffering and contributed to the emergence of the Cold War. The legacy of his rule continues to shape politics and society in the region today. How has Stalin been portrayed in popular culture, and how accurate are these depictions? Stalin has been portrayed in a variety of ways in popular culture, including films, television shows, and literature. However, the accuracy of these depictions varies widely, and many of them are highly fictionalized. In the Soviet Union, Stalin was often portrayed as a heroic and infallible leader. Propaganda posters and films depicted him as a strong and determined figure who was devoted to the well-being of the Soviet people. However, these depictions were highly stylized and did not reflect the reality of Stalin's reign. In Western culture, Stalin has been depicted in a more critical light. Many films and television shows portray him as a ruthless dictator who was responsible for the deaths of millions of people. These depictions are often based on historical accounts of Stalin's reign, and are generally considered to be more accurate than Soviet-era propaganda. One notable portrayal of Stalin in popular culture is in the novel The Death of Stalin by French writer Fabien Nury and illustrated by Thierry Robin. This work is a satirical interpretation of the power struggle that occurred following Stalin's death and the chaotic aftermath. While the events portrayed in the book are based on historical facts, the depictions of the characters are highly exaggerated for comedic effect. Overall, while there have been numerous depictions of Stalin in popular culture, it is important to approach these works with a critical eye. Many of these depictions are highly fictionalized, and may not accurately reflect the reality of Stalin's reign. Some text goes here: what lessons can we learn from Stalin's life and career, and how do they relate to contemporary politics and society? Some text goes here. Stalin's life and career offer several important lessons that are relevant to contemporary politics and society. Here are a few examples. 1. The dangers of authoritarianism. Stalin's reign illustrates the dangers of authoritarianism and the concentration of power in the hands of a single individual or party. His policies of political repression, censorship, and propaganda resulted in significant human suffering and contributed to the erosion of civil liberties and democratic values. 2. The importance of individual rights. Stalin's disregard for individual rights and freedoms led to the suppression of dissent and the persecution of minority groups. This highlights the importance of protecting individual rights, including freedom of speech, association, and religion, in order to prevent the abuse of power by those in positions of authority. 3. The need for transparency and accountability. Stalin's leadership was characterized by secrecy and a lack of accountability. This highlights the importance of transparency and accountability in government and other institutions, in order to prevent corruption and abuse of power. 4. The impact of ideology. Stalin's commitment to communism and his belief in the superiority of the Soviet system led to aggressive foreign policy and a disregard for human rights. This highlights the danger of prioritizing ideology over practical considerations and the importance of taking a nuanced and pragmatic approach to policymaking. Overall, Stalin's legacy serves as a cautionary tale about the dangers of authoritarianism, the importance of protecting individual rights and freedoms, and the need for transparency and accountability in government and other institutions. These lessons remain relevant today, as societies around the world continue to grapple with issues of governance, human rights, and political freedom. Some text goes here. How did Stalin's leadership impact the Soviet Union's involvement in World War II? Some text goes here. Stalin's leadership had a significant impact on the Soviet Union's involvement in World War II. Here are a few key ways in which Stalin's leadership affected the war effort. 1. Mobilization of resources. Stalin's leadership played a crucial role in mobilizing the resources necessary for the Soviet Union to successfully fight the war. Stalin oversaw the rapid industrialization of the Soviet economy, which allowed the country to rapidly expand its military capabilities and produce the equipment and supplies necessary for the war effort. 2. Military strategy. Stalin played an active role in developing and implementing military strategy during the war. He made several key decisions that helped the Soviet Union repel German advances, including the decision to engage in a scorched earth policy, which involved destroying crops and infrastructure in areas occupied by German forces to prevent them from using those resources. 3. Leadership of the Red Army. Stalin also played a key role in leading the Red Army during the war. He was involved in the appointment and promotion of military leaders, and was known for closely monitoring military operations and issuing direct orders to commanders. 4. Political propaganda. Stalin's leadership also played a significant role in shaping the propaganda efforts of the Soviet Union during the war. He oversaw the production of films, posters, and other media that aimed to inspire Soviet citizens and portray the Soviet Union as a heroic defender of the motherland. Overall, Stalin's leadership was instrumental in the Soviet Union's successful defense against the German invasion during World War II. However, it is important to note that his policies also resulted in significant human suffering, including the deaths of millions of Soviet citizens. Some text goes here. What was Stalin's relationship with other world leaders, such as Roosevelt and Churchill? Some text goes here. 1. Franklin D. Roosevelt. Stalin had a complex relationship with Roosevelt, who was the President of the United States during World War II. Although the two leaders had some shared interests in defeating Nazi Germany, they had significant differences in ideology and approach. Stalin was suspicious of Roosevelt's motives and believed that the United States was more interested in promoting its own interests than in helping the Soviet Union. However, the two leaders did collaborate on several key initiatives, such as the establishment of the United Nations. 2. Winston Churchill. Stalin also had a complex relationship with Churchill, who was the Prime Minister of the United Kingdom during World War II. Like Roosevelt, Churchill had some shared interests with Stalin in defeating Nazi Germany, but the two leaders had significant differences in ideology and approach. Churchill was deeply suspicious of Stalin's intentions and believed that the Soviet Union posed a threat to British interests. However, the two leaders did collaborate on several key initiatives, such as the establishment of the Grand Alliance and the Tehran Conference. 3. Mao Zedong. Stalin also had a relationship with Mao Zedong, who was the leader of the Chinese Communist Party. Stalin provided support and guidance to the Chinese Communists during the Chinese Civil War and played a key role in helping Mao establish the People's Republic of China. However, the relationship between the two leaders was marked by tension and conflict, with Mao often feeling overshadowed and controlled by Stalin. Overall, Stalin's relationships with other world leaders were complex and often marked by tension and conflict. While he did collaborate with some leaders on key initiatives, his suspicion of others and his commitment to promoting Soviet interests often led to conflict and distrust. How did Stalin's policies impact the Soviet economy and industrialization efforts? 1. Rapid industrialization. Stalin's policies emphasized rapid industrialization as a means of developing the Soviet economy and catching up to the industrialized nations of the West. This involved a massive expansion of industrial production, with a particular focus on heavy industry such as steel production, coal mining, and machinery manufacturing. 2. 5-year plans. Stalin oversaw the implementation of a series of 5-year plans, which set ambitious targets for industrial production and economic growth. The first 5-year plan, implemented in 1928, called for a massive increase in industrial output over the course of 5 years. The second and third plans continued this emphasis on rapid industrialization. 3. Central planning. Stalin's policies also involved centralizing economic decision-making and planning. This involved the establishment of Gosplan, a central planning agency that was responsible for setting targets for industrial production and allocating resources to different sectors of the economy. 4. Collectivization of agriculture. In addition to industrialization, Stalin's policies also involved the collectivization of agriculture. This involved the consolidation of small, privately owned farms into large collective farms that were owned and managed by the state. The goal of this policy was to increase agricultural productivity and provide a stable food supply for the Soviet population. While Stalin's policies did result in significant industrial growth and economic development, they also had several negative consequences. The focus on heavy industry often came at the expense of consumer goods production, leading to shortages of basic goods and services. Additionally, the collectivization of agriculture resulted in significant hardship for many rural peasants, who were forced to give up their land and work on collective farms. Overall, Stalin's policies had a profound impact on the Soviet economy and society, shaping the country's development for decades to come. Some text goes here. How did Stalin's policies impact the arts and culture in the Soviet Union? Some text goes here. 1. Socialist realism. Stalin's government promoted a style of art called socialist realism, which emphasized realistic depictions of Soviet life and the achievements of the Soviet Union. This style was intended to promote the ideals of socialism and to inspire Soviet citizens to work towards building a better society. 2. Censorship. Stalin's government heavily censored artistic works that were deemed to be critical of the Soviet regime or that did not conform to the principles of socialist realism. Writers, artists, and other cultural figures were often subject to harassment, imprisonment, or execution if their works were seen as being politically dangerous. 3. Control over cultural institutions. Stalin's government exerted tight control over cultural institutions, such as theaters, museums, and publishing houses. These institutions were required to promote the ideals of socialism and to avoid anything that was deemed to be politically subversive. 4. Propaganda. Stalin's government used art and culture as a means of promoting its political agenda and shaping public opinion. Cultural events, such as parades and festivals, were often used as propaganda tools to reinforce the message of Soviet communism. Overall, Stalin's policies had a profound impact on the arts and culture in the Soviet Union. While some artists were able to produce innovative and thought-provoking works within the framework of socialist realism, many others were forced to conform to the strict dictates of the regime or face punishment. This had a chilling effect on artistic expression in the Soviet Union and contributed to a culture of fear and conformity. How did Stalin's policies impact the Soviet education system? 1. Emphasis on science and technology. Stalin's government placed a strong emphasis on science and technology in the Soviet education system. This was seen as a means of advancing the country's industrial and military capabilities and catching up to the West in terms of technological development. 2. Standardization. Stalin's government sought to standardize the Soviet education system, creating a uniform curriculum and teaching methodology that was designed to promote the principles of Soviet communism. This involved a significant centralization of educational decision-making and the establishment of a national system of education. 3. Propaganda. Stalin's government used the Soviet education system as a means of promoting its political agenda and shaping public opinion. Schools were required to promote the ideals of communism and to teach students about the achievements of the Soviet Union. 4. Access to education. Stalin's government made significant efforts to increase access to education in the Soviet Union. This included the establishment of a system of free, compulsory education and the construction of new schools and universities throughout the country.